Everything began in Arequipa, Peru, on a quiet night that was supposed to be no different from any other. The date was March 15th, 2011. At exactly 3:42 a.m., the silence inside the Quispe family's home was shattered. 4-year-old Mateo Quispe bolted upright in his bed, screaming at the top of his lungs. His small body was shaking uncontrollably, his voice raw with panic, as if he had been pulled out of a nightmare too intense for a child to understand. Between sobs, he shouted words that made no sense to anyone in the room. "They threw me," he cried. "The men with feathers threw me. The sacred stones are bleeding." His mother, Elena, froze. She would later say that in that moment, she felt something she couldn't explain. Not fear, not confusion, but the sudden certainty that what she was hearing did not sound like it was coming from a 4-year-old boy. Mateo's voice was different, deeper, urgent, almost distant. His father, Carlos, a local mechanic known for his calm and practical nature, rushed in and tried to comfort him. Eventually, Mateo quieted down, exhausted, as if whatever had possessed him had finally let go. The family assumed it was just a night terror, something children grow out of. They were wrong. Over the next few nights, the same thing happened again. Always at 3:42 a.m. Always with the same phrases. Always with the same terror in Mateo's eyes. Elena began writing everything down in a notebook, not because she believed anything supernatural was happening, but because a mother knows when something isn't normal. She didn't realize she was documenting the beginning of a story that would later leave even skeptics uneasy. Then came the morning that changed everything. 3 days after the first nightmare, the family was sitting at the breakfast table. The mood was calm. Mateo was playing quietly with his toys on the floor. Nothing seemed out of place until he looked up at his mother and spoke casually, as if he were talking about a place he missed. "Mom," he said, "I want to go back to my house in the mountains. I lived there before." Elena's coffee cup slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. Carlos didn't move. Mateo had been born and raised in Arequipa. He had never traveled to the mountains. He had never been to Machu Picchu. And yet, when his parents asked what he meant, he began describing the place with a level of detail that made the room go silent. He talked about Machu Picchu, not like a child repeating something he had heard, but like someone remembering. He described the main temple and its many windows. He spoke about a stone basin filled with rainwater only during certain seasons. He mentioned stairways leading down toward places associated with conjures and rituals. As he spoke, he moved his hands through the air, tracing shapes and symbols no one had ever shown him. "I had a golden altar there," Mateo said quietly. "The priests came to ask me what the sun was saying. I knew when it would rain. I knew when the earth would shake." Elena wrote down every word. Carlos, still skeptical but deeply unsettled, decided to check for himself. He went to the local library and searched for information about Machu Picchu. What he found made his stomach turn. Several of the details Mateo mentioned matched recent archaeological studies, information that never appeared in tourist guides or children's books. And then Mateo said something that changed the tone entirely. He spoke about places inside Machu Picchu that were not accessible to visitors. Areas spoken about only in academic circles. Locations most people would never even hear mentioned. "I mattered there," Mateo said, his expression suddenly serious. "Everyone respected me. Until they decided I knew too much." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. How could a 4-year-old know these things? What the Quispe family didn't realize yet was that this was only the beginning, the first layer of a story that would slowly pull them toward something far bigger than a child's imagination. 2 weeks later, Elena made a decision that would change their lives. "If Mateo says he knows these places," she told her husband, "then we need to see how much of this is real." They traveled nearly 200 kilometers to Lima to visit the National Museum of Archaeology, Anthropology, and History of Peru. They expected curiosity, maybe coincidence. What they experienced instead left everyone in the room in complete silence. The moment Mateo entered the exhibition hall dedicated to Inca culture, his behavior changed. Without hesitation, he walked straight toward a display case holding ceremonial objects from the 15th century. He pointed at a golden vessel and shook his head. "That one doesn't belong to Machu Picchu," he said. "It comes from another place. The symbol is wrong." A museum guide, an experienced archaeologist, stepped closer, intrigued. According to the exhibit label, the artifact was indeed listed as originating from Machu Picchu. But when the museum's internal records were checked, something unexpected surfaced. The object had been reclassified just months earlier. For decades, it had been incorrectly catalogued. And this was only the beginning. Mateo then stopped in front of a replica of the Intihuatana, the sacred stone of Machu Picchu. He examined it carefully and pointed to its base. "This isn't right," he said calmly. "The real one has a crack here." The guide froze. That specific detail was not publicly documented. And for the first time, no one in the room could explain what was happening. None of what Mateo was saying had ever been published in books or shared with the public. Elena recorded everything on her phone. Her 4-year-old son was calmly correcting museum professionals, pointing out mistakes in official displays and mentioning details known only to specialists who had studied Machu Picchu for years. Finally, one of the archaeologists asked the question everyone was thinking. "How does your son know all of this?" Elena answered through tears. "He says he lived there before." The room fell silent. After a long pause, the archaeologist said something he never imagined saying in his career. "We need to take this child to Cusco." In the months that followed the museum visit, Mateo's fascination with Machu Picchu grew stronger and stranger. It was no longer just talk. He spent hours drawing detailed maps of the citadel, building small replicas with stones from the yard, arranging them with unsettling precision. But what frightened his parents the most happened at night. While asleep, Mateo began whispering words they didn't recognize. Elena recorded these moments, listening later with growing unease. The language sounded ancient, rhythmic, not Spanish. When they shared the recordings with the professor of indigenous languages, the response left them shaken. "It sounds like very old Quechua," the professor said. "A form spoken during the time of the Inca Empire," Elena tried to explain. "My son has never studied Quechua. We were both born in Arequipa. We've always spoken Spanish." There was no explanation. Soon after, Mateo began refusing food. "This isn't like the food from the sacred mountain," he would say. He drew plants he claimed once grew in his own garden. He described sunrise ceremonies where gold reflected the first light of the sun, making the temple appear alive. Carlos, who had doubted everything from the beginning, finally reached his breaking point. "If this can help our son," he told Elena, "then it's worth everything we have." They used their savings and planned the trip. The bus ride from Arequipa to Cusco took 10 long hours. Throughout the journey, Mateo barely spoke. He sat quietly by the window, staring at the passing landscape as if he recognized every mountain, every valley, every bend in the road. As the bus approached the imperial city and the sacred mountains appeared on the horizon, something happened that no camera fully captured. Mateo began to cry. Not the cry of a frightened child, but the deep, painful sob of someone returning home after centuries away. "I'm here," he whispered through tears. "Father, son, I'm home." Elena held her son, unable to fully understand what she was witnessing. But one thing was clear. The real test was still ahead. On July 6, 2011, at 5:47 a.m., the first train to Aguas Calientes departed from San Pedro Station in Cusco. The Quispe family was on board, heading toward a moment that would change their lives forever. During the hour-and-a-half journey, Mateo pressed his face against the window, pointing at specific places throughout the sacred valley. "That's where the women wove cloth for the Inca," he said, gesturing toward Ollantaytambo. And there, he added, pointing toward the distant ruins of Pisac, that's where they kept the gold. Every detail matched official archaeological knowledge. Still, nothing prepared them for what happened when they finally arrived at Machu Picchu. The moment Mateo stepped inside, he changed. He no longer walked like a small child. He moved with confidence, heading straight toward specific areas, as if he had spent a lifetime there. Ignoring the usual tourist paths, he guided his parents along a lesser-known route. He led them directly to the area known as the Sacred Rock, a ceremonial altar in the northern part of the site. Elena kept filming. Carlos followed in silence. Then Mateo stopped. Ahead of them was a steep cliff overlooking the Urubamba River, hundreds of meters below. Mateo's face went pale. His eyes filled with fear. Not imagined fear, but something raw and remembered. "That's where I died," he said softly. His voice no longer sounded like that of a 4-year-old. "The men with feathers brought me here at dawn," he continued. "They said I betrayed the gods because I warned that pale men would come from the great salt water." He pointed toward a specific rock formation. "They made me kneel there. They cut me here," he said, touching his neck. "And then they threw me down so the condors could cleanse my soul." Elena stopped recording. Her hands were shaking too badly. Mateo stared into the abyss and whispered something that made his parents' blood run cold. "My spirit never left. I waited 500 years to return and tell the truth." That night, the family stayed at a small hotel in Aguas Calientes, completely shaken. And at 3:42 a.m., the same time as the nightmares back in Arequipa, Mateo woke up with absolute clarity. "Dad," he said, "we have to go back tomorrow. I need to show you where my sacred plate is buried. If they don't find it," he added calmly, "no one will believe who I really am." For the first time, Mateo spoke the name of his former life, Amaru. The next morning, Mateo led his parents back into the ruins. This time, he didn't act like a curious child exploring a famous site. He walked with intention, calm, focused. Near the Temple of the Sun, he stopped. Starting from the main entrance, Mateo counted his steps out loud. 1, 2, 3. At 127, he stopped exactly where he said he would. He looked down at the ground and pointed with unsettling precision. "It's here," he said, "about 3 meters below. Wrapped in red cloth. I hid it before they captured me," he added softly. "I knew they were coming." Elena wrote everything down. Carlos paced the distance himself, counting carefully. The measurement matched, the direction, the angle, even the alignment relative to the temple walls. Then Mateo continued. "There's also a gold necklace," he said, "with turquoise beads, and a small vessel with ashes from sacred coca leaves. I prepared it for my last ritual." What happened next was the most disturbing part. Kneeling in the damp soil, Mateo began drawing in the dirt. Not random shapes, but a clear, organized diagram. Depths, positions, relative distances. Each object placed in relation to the others with shocking accuracy. It looked like the work of a trained archaeologist. "When they look here someday," Mateo said with absolute certainty, "they'll find exactly what I'm telling you. Then they'll know Amaru was real." Carlos took photos of everything. The drawings, the measurements, the exact spot. At the time, he thought he was just humoring his son. He didn't know he was recording what would later be described as one of the most precise archaeological predictions ever associated with oral testimony. As they stood there, one terrifying question echoed in both parents' minds. What if someone actually finds something? On September 18, 2011, just over 2 months later, something unexpected happened. According to accounts shared later, the same archaeologist who had met Mateo in the museum managed to obtain permission for a limited exploratory investigation in the area Mateo had indicated. Officially, the request was framed as a verification based on traditional oral narratives. No mention of a 4-year-old, claiming to remember a past life. The work began early in the morning. A small team was present, specialists, measuring tools, careful hands. At 2.87 meters below the surface, just centimeters shy of the depth, Mateo had predicted, a tool struck something solid. "Stop," someone said. Wrapped in red textile, preserved far better than anyone expected, lay a thin ceremonial gold plate. The team fell silent. It matched Mateo's description in size and shape almost perfectly. Nearby, they uncovered the necklace. Not 21 beads, but 22. A tiny discrepancy that, strangely, made the account feel more believable. And just where Mateo said it would be, there was the small vessel, containing residue later identified as burned ceremonial coca leaves. But the most unsettling discovery came when the gold plate was examined closely. Its engraving showed scenes of astronomical observation, ritual communication with ancestors, and most disturbingly, a depiction of a sacrifice at a cliff matching the exact location Mateo had pointed out weeks earlier. Subsequent analysis placed the objects firmly in the 15th century, during the height of the Inca Empire. When the archaeologist saw the full results, he made a call he never expected to make. "Elena," he said, his voice unsteady, "I need you to come to Lima and bring Mateo." 3 days later, inside a university laboratory, something happened that no one present could explain. Mateo walked into the room and saw the artifacts for the first time. He didn't gasp. He didn't ask questions. He simply walked over to the gold plate, gently touched its surface and said, "This is mine. I carved the prophecy here," he added calmly, "about the pale men who had come from the great salt water." A recorder was turned on. As the room listened in silence, Mateo began describing the engravings, symbol by symbol, figure by figure, with the confidence of someone explaining his own work. And once again, he spoke not in Spanish, but in an ancient form of Quechua, the same language his parents had heard him whisper in his sleep. No one in the room could explain how a 4-year-old child could know what he was saying, and no one was prepared for what it might mean. Dr. Carmen Josa, a specialist in pre-Columbian languages, translated in real time as Mateo spoke. "I am Amaru, keeper of the secrets of Inti. I foresaw the arrival of the bearded ones with cold metal. They would bring the end of the golden age, but also the seed of a new dawn." Then something happened that unsettled everyone in the room. Mateo picked up the small vessel containing the coca ashes and lifted it close to his face. He inhaled deeply. His expression changed. For a brief moment, he was no longer a 4-year-old child. There was something older there, calmer, heavier, as if centuries were looking through his eyes. "I knew I would return," he said, in a voice that did not sound like his own. "I knew my soul would come back in the age of flying machines and talking mirrors. I returned to warn what comes next." Only later did they realize something even more disturbing. When the recording was reviewed, a second voice could be heard, deeper, rougher, older, speaking at the same time as Mateo, in clear, ancient Quechua. Elena felt her skin crawl when she heard it days later. Her 4-year-old son and the voice of a 500-year-old priest had spoken simultaneously. Dr. Espinosa understood that artifacts alone were not enough. If this story was to be taken seriously, it needed historical grounding. What he found in the colonial archives of Cusco left him speechless for 3 consecutive days. In the chronicles of Spanish historian Pedro Ciza de Leon, dated 1553, there was a passage that froze his blood. A priest named Amaru was executed at the fortress of Picchu, accused of heresy for predicting the arrival of bearded men from the sea. The Inca nobility considered him dangerous for his visions of the future. But there was more, much more. In the General Archive of the Indies in Seville, Spain, a document from 1547 stated, "The heretic Amaru of Picchu was thrown from the sacred precipice after refusing to renounce his prophecies regarding the destruction of the empire. His followers claim he will return when Tawantinsuyu requires a new awakening. Espinosa contacted Dr. Miguel Cornejo, a respected historian specializing in colonial chronicles. After 2 weeks of research, Cornejo's conclusion left Espinosa shaken. "Ricardo," he said, "this priest, Amaru, truly existed. And what's worse, the records indicate he was executed exactly where the child described. The location, the timing, even the method. According to colonial records, Amaru was executed at dawn on the northern precipice of Machu Picchu after a ceremonial trial. The date, March 15, 1533, exactly 478 years before Mateo's first nightmares began. On March 15, 2011, the documents also detailed Amaru's prophecies. He spoke of metal birds flying like condors, of mirrors that showed distant people, of a time when children would speak with the voices of ancestors. But the most shocking discovery came from a Vatican archive. A letter dated 1548, written by the Bishop of Cusco to the Pope, described the blasphemous prophecies of the heretic Amaru, who claimed that Inca souls would return in the bodies of children when the world crossed into a new millennium. When Elena heard this over the phone, her hands shook so violently she could barely hold it. Her son hadn't just predicted archaeological discoveries. He had returned exactly when a man 5 centuries earlier said he would. The circle was closing in a way no one could explain. Today, 13 years after those first nightmares, Mateo Quispe is 17. He lives a seemingly normal life in Arequipa. He studies civil engineering, plays football with his friends, has a girlfriend, but every year, on March 15th, something changes. Elena has kept everything: recordings, photographs, measurements, academic reports, historical documents. What began as a worried mother's journal became one of the most complete case archives related to reincarnation ever assembled in Latin America. Dr. Espinosa, now Director of Andean Archaeology at the National University of San Marcos, has referenced the case in 3 international scientific publications. He never uses the word reincarnation, but his work on ancestral knowledge transmitted through non-conventional pathways has sparked debate worldwide. And the story doesn't end with Mateo. Since 2015, similar cases have emerged across Peru, children from Andean communities describing archaeological sites they have never visited with impossible accuracy. Official institutions have documented more than 20 such cases. Dr. Carmen Josa now leads a structured research protocol involving ancient Quechua recordings, linguistic analysis, and archaeological verification. We are facing a phenomenon that challenges Western concepts of memory and consciousness, she wrote in her most recent study. Mateo last visited Machu Picchu in July 2023. This time, it was simply a farewell, a quiet visit to the place that shaped his childhood. Park rangers reported something unusual. For the 40 minutes, Mateo stood near the precipice where Amaru was executed. Not a single condor flew overhead, something never before recorded in the sanctuary's ornithological history. When asked about memories of past lives, Mateo answers calmly, with wisdom beyond his years. "I don't need to remember everything anymore," he says. "I fulfilled my purpose. Death isn't the end. Souls return when their mission is unfinished. So what was Amaru's true mission? And how many other truths from the past are still waiting, not in books, not in ruins, but in the minds of children, yet to wake up one night screaming things no one taught them? Some mysteries refuse to stay buried, and sometimes they insist on being remembered."